Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Aman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, we're going to be taking a deep dive look into the halfback position for 2025. If you enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up. Please do consider subscribing as well if you want to see more content through the preseason. We're on the road to 5,000 subscribers at the time of recording, which is just an insane number to think about. Would appreciate it so much if we can get there by the start of round one. Go and follow me on my socials as well if you aren't already, on Twitter, on Instagram. Obviously I'm on YouTube, but I've also started a Patreon as well where I'm posting some extra content as well. I've got some spreadsheets out there on Patreon that you can also access for draw difficulty sorting and a trade planner. You can also access those separately on a website, which I've also linked below. But yeah, do check that out as well if you are interested. In saying all of that, let's get into the video. So quickly taking a look at the halfback position, how it's fared in seasons gone past. Look, it's a very high upside position. As you can see, at least in 2023, it featured the top two of the entire 20 list in Hynes and Cleary. Last year, Cleary was the number one, but it was around in 5th spot with an average of 83. Jerome Hughes had a stellar season last year on his way, of course, to winning the Dally M. Nico Hynes did slide back in average last year at 75, but again, he still made it into the top 20. What you're seeing is there's probably 3 to 4 names each year who are always going to be there in halfback. Cleary and Hynes traditionally have been the ones, and last year there was a big discussion at the start of last year about do you just start with both of them? I haven't seen that discussion come up as much this year, but we'll get into all of that. And Jerome Hughes really shot through because you can see in 2022 he went from 69, which is a good average, but 2023 he wasn't there in the top 20, and then shot up all the way up to 82 in 2024. So I think for me, when it comes to halfback and squad structures, I think you either go two guns who are very expensive, like a Cleary Hynes or Cleary Hughes, or you go at least one. I think you definitely need at least one of Cleary, Hughes, or Hynes. And then I think you maybe go with a cheaper option, who there's a couple that may be floating around that we can start with in round one. Or I think you just go two guns, because I think halfback is too important of a position in terms of you've got captain picks available there in Cleary, or you've got potentially even cash generation ability from Hynes this year as well. For me, squad structure, I need to have at least one. I think the question is, which one do you go? But you'll see some numbers which show where the general masses are thinking, but let's get into that just now. So I wanted to I'll probably be spending most of this video, I think, talking about Cleary, Hynes, and Hughes, and then a little bit on the value picks. I've got a little bit on Cherry Evans and Moses later. There's a few other guys who feature, like a Tamara Martin, Dylan Brown, who now do have halfback eligibility. But I think because they're available in 5'8", which I think is just a weak position, I'm not going to discuss them in this video. I'm going to talk about them in the 5'8" video, just because I think there's more value to having them there in your squad, as opposed to taking up a halfback slot, where I think you got better options in Cleary, Hynes, and Jerome Hughes. So taking a look at these three, so Cleary's the most expensive at 811k, which is actually, when you look at it, not a bad price, considering that in seasons gone past, he's kind of been closer to around 880, 890. He obviously had a very injury affected last year. So he had 3 games where he scored over 100, but that came from 10 games. So 30% of the time he went big, and he's 46% owned at the moment in SuperCoach. So I think this already tells you where most people are leaning towards, where they're spending their money for a gun halfback. And look, in the first video I showed on my draft, I didn't have Cleary. I actually started with Hynes, purely just because of, I think, price. I thought, well, he's a little bit cheaper, I might just go Hynes. Look, I haven't tinkered with my team that much. I'm very confident that I think Cleary is going to edge it for me in round one. For me, it's just the fact that he's always the most he's very consistent. Hynes, we have the numbers below. He was impacted with Braden Trindle in the side, and whereas Cleary now without Luai, look, there may be a dip without Luai, and there's not much of a sample size for Cleary without Jerome Luai. Only 2 games, I think it was in 2023, where he scored 53 and 101. The 53 was against Manly away, so it was a slightly tougher game. The 101, I think, was against the Cowboys, I think, at home. And this is when the Cowboys were probably leaking some points as well. But last year, without injury-affected games, he would have averaged 89. And so you're looking at someone who's priced on 83, can average 89. We just know he can also go huge as well. I can completely understand the 46% ownership, and I don't think I need to be sitting here going and digging into stats and whatnot. You all know how good this man is. I think the question is him or Hynes Hughes. Now thinking about it more, I think it's going to be Cleary and one of these two. If you're looking at the 2-gun approach, I think Cleary almost is, for me now, non-negotiable. Now the draw-wise is pretty tough. if you look at it, but round one is in Vegas, and we saw that Vegas was fairly high scoring. You know, the NRL want it to be that way as well. It's kind of their marketing tool to the global audience, I guess, and global, at least in America. And so I think Cleary round one doesn't really faze me that much. Round two, it's the Roosters, but it's at home, and the Roosters, I think, are not going to be as strong, at least at the beginning of the season. Melbourne away is, of course, tough, grand final rematch. But then it's the Rabbitohs, Cowboys, Dolphins, Roosters again. You know, like, there's no easy games. Like, and when I say easy, I probably mean like West Tigers and Titans and things like that. Teams who do traditionally concede a lot of points. But I think Cleary is someone who's matchup proof. Like, I didn't even bother digging into his averages against the opposition because he scored 129 against the Broncos last year in round 3. And this was the Broncos that had just come off the grand final. Of course, the Broncos went on to have a pretty poor season by their standards, but Cleary, I think, is just pretty matchup proof. Now, Hynes is much more of a talking point, I think. So 735k, average of 75 last year. He did have 3 games over 100, and he did have 3 pretty big games where he scored over 100. He had a stretch where he went and scored 142 and 160 and 114, and that was all within kind of 4 to 5 rounds of each other. Only one of those games was with Braden Trindle, and that was a game he scored 142. His biggest score when he scored 160, that was against Canberra, and he didn't have Trindle. And I think it's pretty obvious that with Trindle, he does get capped in terms of how much his involvement is running the team. Look, he's the goal kicker, which is great. It means he's always going to be getting some additional points if the Sharks do pile on the points. This is kind of the argument I'm hearing with Hynes, at least online and what I've seen. People are saying he averaged 75, but it was a pretty poor season. Therefore, I think he's going to uptick in his average. My potential counter now, though, is yes, he averaged 75 and he was poor, but he had these huge games without Trindle, which, look, he's very capable of doing, but 160, I'm not a big fan of just taking averages without certain games just for the sake of it. But I'm sure that 75 average for the season would go down massively if you didn't include that 160. He also did have an injury-affected game, which I've called out in the notes below me as well. So his average was 94 without Trindle. If you exclude a non-injury game, though, it was up to 124. And that's because it was so boosted by that 160 score that he did have and 114 that he also had. So I think Hynes, like, I've been more pro him in the preseason than not. And I think if I've got the ability to make it work, I will probably go Cleary Hynes if I can. Because I think Hynes, even at 735k, 75 average, yes, he was poor, but I think that could take more time to gel with Trindle. Doesn't have a bye in the first 12 weeks as well, and the draw is pretty good, I think, from round 6 onwards, and so you can kind of set and forget him. The alternative could be that you don't start with Hynes, and then maybe in round 5, when the draw does start to open up, points scoring is probably a little bit higher as well. At that point, you can make an assessment on him and decide, you know what, I'm going to go get him at this particular point in time now. But I'm flipped now, I think, on my original decision, which was Hynes over Cleary. I'm much more now in the camp of, I think I'm just going to start with Cleary. I'm going to forget about the draw, and this is a lesson I'm trying to tell myself for this year, which is don't pay as much attention to the draw at the opening points of the season. I have a tendency to do this, and it sometimes has shot me in the foot. So I think I'm just going to go not overthinking. I'll probably just start with Cleary, and if it doesn't work, you can trade down to Hynes, but you can't do the opposite, I guess. But I think Hynes is going to be, if I had to predict, I think he'll be up on his 75 average. I think he's probably going to be, if he plays the entire season with Trindle, I think he's probably going to stick to that 75 average. I think you'll probably just find that there's going to be less of those really big kind of 130, 40 scores that he can get. He's probably more going to be someone who ticks along, because he's got pretty good base stats as well, 31 base, more than these other two. I think he's someone who's probably going to be early 70s to occasional 80s and 90s scores. That's how I feel his season will go if he plays the entire season with Trindle, but that all equalizes to an average around 75 to maybe call it 80. That's where I think he's going to end up, which is good. But at the start of the season when money is capped, if I had to pick one of him or Cleary, I think Cleary's the way I'm going to be going. Hughes, you can definitely see is the least owned of these three, 7% ownership. I can understand why as well. 805k. While he's historically been like a great Supercoach option, he had a 69 average in 2022, 71 in 2023, and even 73 in 2021 as well. But 2021 was a high scoring season. He is someone who's always generally around that periphery of the early 70s. Last year, though, was just a massive step up. If you look at his averages with Munster and without, doesn't really read too much into it. It was an 84 average with Munster, 81 without. So I think he was generally just stepping up as a player. I think the reason why he's low owned and why I haven't really considered him, I think is just because it was a Dally M season. Do I expect it to keep it up? I'm not entirely sure. There's that buy in round 2 as well, if I wanted to add more confirmation bias. Then Penrith round 3. I don't think I'd be starting with him. I think I'd be looking him maybe round 4, round 5 when the draw does start to open up a little bit for Melbourne. I just think it's someone who could potentially be overpriced, because if he does revert back to maybe that early 70s average, which he's been more of in the last kind of 3-4 years, then he's potentially 5 to 10 points overpriced. And so I think when you're looking at that and looking at value to start the year, probably doesn't quite present it for me. He also doesn't goal kick. So at least with Hynes, he goal kicks, Cleary goal kicks. So that's why you see their scoring numbers are much higher than him. He's much more reliant on his running game and breaking the line breaks and things like that to get his SuperCoach points. That's why you can see his evasive numbers are 19 versus the other two of 12 and 8. So I think with me, Hughes, much more reliant on doing that kind of work rather than say just goal scoring. And I think early buy, potentially overpriced. I'd much rather have Hynes, I think, for cheaper. So for me, Hughes, I haven't really considered him for round 1. I think if I'm wanting to go 2-gun halves, it's Cleary and Hynes, I think, for me. Just digging a little bit more into Cleary as well as to why I've now put him on that number 1 spot over Hynes. So if you look at his non-injury / suspension games in the last few years, 89 average in 2024, 93 in 23, and 86 in 2022. Basically what we're seeing is a guy who, if he gets a clean bit of health, he's generally going to be averaging mid-80s, if not higher. Very, very small sample size of average without Luai as well. It's not 101. It's actually, it is 101. The stat I had previously, I think he actually scored 149 versus the Cowboys, 53 versus Manly, 149 versus the Cowboys. That's why his average is so big. But I wouldn't read so much into that as well. We don't know how he's going to go without Luai, but I would suspect that, look, he's just such a good player. I think he'll be fine. So that's why I think he's ranked number 1 for me. In terms of early starts to the season as well, Cleary sometimes has slow starts, but again, we look at his slow starts. In 2023, it was 85, 71 last year, 98 in 2022. Not bad numbers. So I think for me, very, very obvious. I'm going to be starting with Cleary at this point, and I'll see if I can fit in Hynes as well. Just quickly touching on a couple of other picks who are, I think, more gun options who are over 60 averaging. That's Cherry Evans and Moses. I'll be very, very honest. I haven't once considered either of these two. Cherry Evans, yes, he's got the good drawn paper, but I think you don't want to overload too much on Manly. And if you're wanting to get players from Manly because of that good opening start, a lot of games at home, I'd be going Turbo, I'd be going Garrick, I'd be going Olakuatu. I don't think you necessarily need to force in someone like a Cherry Evans. Look, you could as a bit of a pod if you wanted to go Cleary and him. I don't hate that, and maybe chance that he goes well. If you can spike him going up to maybe 750, 800k, maybe in round 5 after he's played Parramatta, maybe you switch into a Jerome Hughes who's maybe gone down in price. I don't hate that strategy if that's what you're looking for, but he is someone who, without goal kicking Cherry Evans, he's going to be around this mid-60s averaging normally. And so I don't hate that strategy. If you're wanting to go point of difference and you're thinking Cherry Evans, good draw, and then I'll swap, I just find sometimes these things don't work, especially at the beginning of the season when it is hard to predict when the attacker stats are going to come. And with Mitch Moses, it looks as though some of the wording is that Moses won't be goal kicking this year. Zach Lomax will retain the goal kicking after moving to Parramatta. And I think Moses without goal kicking goes much further down in my stocks. 64 average last year was very injury affected, of course. That's why his total points was only 514. He's still 8% owned, which I think is too high, just especially if he does lose goal kicking. So yeah, for me, I don't think Moses is going to be featuring for me. And I've put these two's stats in comparison to those other 3 guns that I mentioned. Just the biggest difference with them, I mean, base is a little bit lower for someone like a Moses, but it's really the scoring is down for Cherry Evans because he doesn't goal kick. But it's also just those creative numbers as well. Like where Hynes has the same kind of creative numbers as Moses, he's got much higher base. He averages 31 in base, which is quite a lot for a halfback. So you can see the difference in, I think, those 3 versus these 2. So for me, not really considering them at all. Maybe you can chance Cherry Evans as a bit of a pod to pair up with a Cleary to start. So I've kind of skipped a lot of players in the halfbacks around the 500Ks, but I think I'm very much a firm believer of you either just go the 2 guns, or I think you just go a cheapie and a gun. And so we're going to discuss a few potential cheapies here as well. I won't mention Sanders Smith because I went into much more detail on Sanders Smith in the hooker analysis video if you do want to check that one out. He's 53% owned. I think he's the most owned player in SuperCoach at the moment, and I think that's for good reason. He's in my starting team as well. It's just whether or not you pick him at hooker or halfback. I think it just depends on how the chips fall with other cheapies. If there's no good cheapies available at hooker, then maybe you just go Sanders Smith there. And then what you can do is maybe get someone like a Lewis Dodd at the Rabbitohs. He's 336k. He's 11% owned at the moment. It's a little bit meh. We haven't seen him in the NRL. Like, he could be a very slow burn. He could be a little bit like Lockie Ilias of other seasons in the past. But there's, again, if you're not inspired by it, then maybe you go and say, I'm going to just go get two guns, get Cleary and Hynes. I'm tempted by that as well. I think this is probably a bigger question around Isaiah Ayongi. If you start with him and you've got the money, if I don't go 3-gun fullbacks, I will most likely go Cleary and Hynes unless we get a good quality cheapie in the halfback spot. Lewis Dodd could be a bit of a mid-ranger danger vibes about him. I've currently got him, but that's also just more of a squad structure thing just because I'm trying to go a little bit cheaper in that second spot for the time being. You've got Tanner Boyd moving to the Warriors. I don't think he'll start the round one. I think it's going to be Luke Metcalf and Tamara Martin, and Luke Metcalf looked pretty good as well in the Warriors preseason trial. Metcalf was also goal kicking, which is a great plus for him. So I think you're probably going to find that Boyd won't be there, at least in the starting half. So probably not a consideration. Ethan Sanders, I've just written him here more for like keep him in your back book, your black book, whatever you call it, just in case if there's any time that maybe one of Ethan Strange or Jamal Fogarty goes down. Sanders looked pretty decent in the preseason trial yesterday, and he may feature potentially at that point in time, but probably not a round one consideration. I think the most interesting potential cheaper we've got at halfback is Tom Duffy. So I'm not taking any credit for this. This is all courtesy of the SC Whisperer and Inside Fantasy Sports guys who posted this quote that came from Zach Labor at the Cowboys. So it said, Tom Duffy has been striking them real well. He was the top point scorer in Cup last year, and he's been hitting them really good. Drinky kicked when Val Holmes was out, so it's those two leading the way. I'm confident I can help out if needed to. So that's Zach Labot on the Cowboys kicking duties in 2025. The way that Labot has read this or said this quote about the goal kicking, it's almost like it's a shoo-in that Tom Duffy's in the team as it is, and it's just a question of whether he goal kicks or not. Now, of course, we need to see some team lists to verify this, of course, but it looks like maybe we might get Tom Duffy at 198k. If that's the case and he's starting, I think he's going to be an absolute no-brainer. I think you just go and pick him in your team. Most people then will probably go Cleary and Tom Duffy, and they'll probably put Sanders Smith then at their hooker spot, which is completely fine. So look, TBD, we have to see what happens here, but Tom Duffy could be a great cheapie at halfback if it does look like he's won the starting 7 spot for the Cowboys. Well, that's it, guys. That is my halfback analysis. I wanted to keep this one pretty short and sweet, just given that it's generally, the analysis is generally towards the top guns in Cleary and Hynes, so I wanted to spend most of my time there. Short and sweet. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Do please give it a thumbs up if you did, and please subscribe as well, and if you want to see more content in the 2025 preseason and throughout the year as well. And we'll see you all in the next one.